And good afternoon, and thank you, Lisa, for inviting me, and thank you for spending some time with me. My name is Evan Weiner, easy for me to say. And we're going to go back to a little slice of Americana, roughly 1955 to 1958, the early days of rock and roll music. And if you were in Brooklyn or if you were in the city and you decided that you wanted to take the subway, you could go to the Brooklyn Paramount. And Alan Freed is going to present a holiday of stars, which includes Fats Domino and Jerry Lee Lewis and the Everlys and Buddy Holly. So this is around 1958. The Crickets, the Rays, Danny and the Juniors, and a very young guy by the name of Paul Anka, who of all of these people is still performing all these years later. I guess Jerry Lewis could perform if he wanted to, and I think he does every once in a while. The early days of rock and roll music, and rock and roll music was not accepted by a lot of people back in the 50s. That is Alan Freed, WJW Radio in Cleveland, and he has the show on for about 2 hours a night, and it's called the Moondog Show, and he comes up with the term rock and roll. Sam Phillips discovered Elvis. Dick Clark, well, American Bandstand. Bill Haley in the Comets, Rock Around the Clock. Little Richard, Lucille, among others.
Yeah.
Chuck Berry doing the duck walk over there. In Elvis, in Jailhouse Rock. Bad Influence, rock and rolls, the devil's music, beware, the hypnotic voodoo rhythm. Reckless dance down the devil's road of sin and self-destruction, leading youth to eternal damnation in the fiery depths of hell. I don't know, you're still around? You're interested in rock and roll? I don't think that happened to you. But that was what people thought. Now, the top 10, 1950. Goodnight Irene, Gordon Jenkins and the Weavers. Mona Lisa, which is played here and there 72 years ago. Third Man Theme, if you watch the Beatles Get Back documentary on Disney, Third Man Theme was played by them in 1969. Sam Song, Gary and Bing Crosby. Simple Melody, Gary and Bing Crosby. Music, 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 Teresa Brewer. Again, the Third Man Theme, Guy Lombardo, who did more than New Year's Eve at the Waldorf. Chattanooga Shoeshine Boy, Red Foley. Harbor Lights, Sammy Kaye. Isn't It Fair, Sammy Kaye and Don Cornell. Not necessarily geared to teenagers, that top 10 list, but teenagers weren't buying records per se in 1950. Now, was Louis Jordan the first rock and roller? Louis Jordan's 1949 song Saturday Night Fish Fry is considered a contender for the title of first rock and roll record. Ain't That a Shame? There's Fats Domino. Well, Fats Domino had this to say about rock and roll. Rock and roll is nothing but rhythm and blues, and we've been playing it for years down in New Orleans. As far as Fats Domino was concerned, rock and roll was simply a new marketing strategy for the style of music he had been recording since 1949. And on December 10th, 1949, Fats Domino released what would become his first hit, The Fat Man. The Fat Man. The title of the first rock and roll song is open to debate. Along with The Fat Man, other contenders include Jackie Brenston's Rocket 88, which he recorded with Ike Turner, Jimmy Preston's Rock the Joint, and Sister Rosetta Tharp's Strange Things Happen Every Day. But The Fat Man is considered one of the first rock and roll songs. Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters was a guitarist in Memphis, and he was a rhythm and blues guy. And Little Richard once said of rhythm and blues, if rhythm and blues had a baby and somebody named it rock and roll. A number of important R&B artists were part of the beginning of rock and roll, including Muddy Waters, Willie Mae Big Mama Thornton, and Joe Turner. Rocket 88. And that is with Ike Turner's band. In 1951, Rocket 88, a song by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, which was Ike Turner's band, has often been cited as the first rock and roll record disc. It was recorded at Sam Phillips' Memphis recording studio. It was also the first #1 rhythm and blues hit for the Chicago-based Chess Brothers, a pair of Jewish immigrants. from Poland, Phil and Leonard Chess, who set up shop in Chicago and became the king of rhythm and blues recordings. The Delta Cats, Ike Turner and his Kings of Rhythm. Rocket 88 was the third biggest rhythm and blues single. Jukebox plays of 1951, according to Billboard magazine, and ninth in record sales. The song's lyrics were about cars, girls, sex, alcohol, and freedom. Let me think of that. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And here you got a song about cars, okay, girls, sex, alcohol, freedom. Hey, that makes sense for a teenage guy in 1951. It was designed to appeal to all teenagers. It was designed to appeal to all teenagers. I'm going to mute everybody here so we don't get any background noise. But it was for males, obviously. So Rocket 88 was about that. And there are the Chess brothers, Phil and Leonard Chess in Chicago. Two Polish-born immigrants founded Chess Records, which would become the preeminent blues label of the 50s and 60s. Eventually, they would create a monopoly of Chicago music recording, doing sessions and releasing recordings by every major blues performer, from Johnny Lee Hooker to Elmo James, who is immortalized on a Beatles song that George Harrison wrote back in 1969. The king of the slide guitar was Elmore James. To Bo Diddley, through Jimmy Reed, and Chuck Berry was also on the label. For You Blue is the song that George Harrison references Elmore James. Chess Records, Howling Wolf. Sam Phillips would send his guys up to Chicago to get recorded. The Chess Brothers created the label in 1950, and they looked for talent outside of Chicago. Chicago had a big pool of R&B players because they came up from the South looking for jobs in the Chicagoland area, and a lot of talent came up to Chicago. And the Chess Brothers became acquainted with Sam Phillips at Memphis Sun Records. The greatest find in Memphis was Howling Wolf, along with Muddy Waters, who became the biggest name in Chicago blues. That is Big Mama Thornton. She was a big woman. She was like 6 foot, weighed about 300 pounds, and she's one of the mothers of rock and roll. Willie Mae Thornton was called Big Mama for both her size and her robust, powerful voice. In August, and this is back in 1953, at a recording session in Southwest Los Angeles, she's approached by these two young songwriters, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, and they give her a song, 12-bar blues vocal song called Hound Dog. The song is filled with open sexual references and whoops and barks, and it was released in 1953, and it soon topped the R&B charts. Now, it sold 2 million copies, but it only received, or Thornton only received $500 for recording the song, which is actually good money. Now it would be about $6,500. That's Big Joe Turner, and he failed at the Apollo. And because he failed at the Apollo, he might have become the first rock and roller. Bad break turns out well. In April 1951, Joe Turner had an unfortunate gig at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, singing with Count Basie's band as a last-minute substitute for Jimmy Rushing. The audience laughed as he missed cues, but the Atlantic Records head, Ahmet Erdogan, was there, and he wanted to sign Turner to Atlantic. In 1954, Joe Turner would record Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Shake, Rattle, and Roll is a rock and roll standard, and in the recent Beatles Get Back 8-hour, actually, it was 8 hours streaming on Disney, one of the songs sung as the Beatles were going through songs was Shake, Rattle, and Roll back in 1969. That is Sister Rosetta Tharp, another contender for the first rock and roll song. Goes back to 1938 with her spiritual Rock Me. She held her soaring high notes, and she had sexual growls. 1944, Strange Things Happen Every Day is a contender for the first rock and roll song. And she had a lot of influence on people. Johnny Cash and Elvis and Chuck Berry and Aretha Franklin and Bob Dylan all thought that she was great. So rock and roll, Cleveland, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, 2017. Come on, tune in. The Moondog House, WJW, blues, rhythm, and jazz. Alan Freed was kind of a voice in Cleveland. He was on radio doing classical shows. He was doing some stuff on TV, and he finds this niche. He spins him ket. He's hep, that Freed. And his show was sponsored by Record Rendezvous in Cleveland, and this is the first rock and roll show. In an effort to introduce rhythm and blues to a broader, wide audience, which was hesitant to embrace black music, Cleveland, Ohio disc jockey Alan Freed used the term rock and roll to describe rhythm. And no, I don't have any music. Unfortunately, don't have any music. We're just going to talk about it. To describe rhythm and blues in 1951. Freed called rhythm and blues records he played rock and roll. Rock and roll is an interesting term because it was slang for having sex in the Negro community. In 1922, there was a song sung by Trixie Smith called My Man Rocks Me with One Steady Roll, which featured the words rock and roll. May 1951, 60-Minute Man by Billy Ward and the Dominoes, which is one of the most sexually explicit rhythm and blues songs ever to cross over to the pop charts. Rock and roll was filled, or the early days of rock and roll was filled with kind of sex, except for this one. This one doesn't have sex. Bill Haley in his comments, rock around the clock. We're going to rock around the clock, which I use for my granddaughter to teach her 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, rock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, rock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. Anyway, Bill Haley and his Comets formed in 1952. He'd been a country western performer, and he recorded a western-style version of Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats' Rocket 88, which was a rhythm and blues song. And that changes his musical direction. 1953, Bill Haley gets his first national success with an original song called Crazy Man Crazy. And then there's the Blackboard Jungle. Now, what does the Blackboard Jungle have to do with rock and roll? Everything. Everything. This is Sidney Poitier's first real meaty role. Of course, he passed away just recently. And he's in Blackboard Jungle. And this movie actually introduced rock and roll to you and you and you and you and you. Blackboard Jungle is a social drama. It's a film about teachers in an interracial inner-city school based on a 1954 novel, The Blackboard Jungle by Evan Hunter. The movie highlighted violence in urban schools and helped spark the rock and roll revolution by featuring the hit song Rock Around the Clock, which wasn't a hit song at that point, by Bill Haley and his Comets. The movie is simple. It's an idealistic teacher who confronts the realities of juvenile delinquency. And that was Sidney Poitier's breakout role. The film hit a nerve with the brutal depiction of social conditions of urban schools. Fights and riots broke out in many towns in England where the movie was shown. The film was about juvenile delinquency and had an unusual amount of black actors for a 1955 movie and Sidney Poitier's breakout performance. And Bill Haley's song ushered in a frightening era for parents. Rock and roll was here to stay. And the movie and rock and roll, somehow, juvenile delinquency comes out of that. And if you listen to rock and roll, there was a chance you could become a juvenile delinquent. So the film actually has its place in rock and roll history, and there's Bill Haley and his Comets playing to an audience. The song Rock Around the Clock didn't grab much attention. It was released as the other side of one of the songs that Haley released in 1954. So nobody really gave too much attention to it. But it fits into Blackboard Jungle and becomes a hit. And it's the first rock and roll song to top the Billboard pop chart and is credited with introducing rock music to a mainstream audience. In 1954, Bill Haley and his Comets recorded a song with the title Rock Around the Clock as a late addition to their A-side single, 13 Women and Only One Man Left in Town. That man's got to repopulate the world. He's going to be a tired guy. A song about a nuclear bomb blast that left just 14 people alive. 13 Women, that song sold 75,000 copies. And so MGM has got a deal with the publisher of the music for Rock Around the Clock to use in Blackboard Jungle. It was not really a well-known song, but it was there, and prompted other juvenile delinquent titles like Juvenile Jungle with Corey Allen and Rebecca Wells and Ann Whitfield and Joe DeRita. He's probably the most famous guy in this cast because he was one of the latter Three Stooges. In fact, he might have been the last Curly Joe. The film director of Blackboard Jungle, Richard Brooks, decided to play Rock Around the Clock over the opening credits of the film. Adults were shocked by the film's violent disobedience of the teenagers, but younger audiences' reactions were entirely different. Many cinemas, kids were dancing in the aisles when the song was played. In some theaters, there was a perceived link between rock and roll rebellion and juvenile delinquency, which led to abnormally bad behavior. So the perception is born. Rock and roll leads to juvenile delinquency. But Rock Around the Clock sold 1 million copies in 1955. So the song that came out. This wasn't a 45. This was on a 78. I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent, sung in the film Rock, Rock, Rock by Frankie, Lyman and the Teenagers. You could see people were really concerned about rock and roll leading to juvenile delinquency, of which there was a lot in the 1950s. It was about sex and violence, at least that was the perception. It also featured black musicians, which meant rock and roll was becoming even more of a threat to society because it was black musicians. In the 1950s, there was a worry that rock and roll would pull the white man down to the level of the Negro as part of the plot to undermine the morals of the youth of our nation. The irony of all this, and as you look at Jerry Lee Lewis, is where the music came from. The Pentecostal church inspired many first-generation rock and rollers. Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Little Richard, B.B. King, and others were raised in or regularly attended Pentecostal services in their youth. Rock and roll, the soundtrack to rebellion, and music, sideburn delinquents, the music of sideburn delinquents and teenage consumers owe the surprising debt to religion. Gospel music was a major, major influence. The church. A lot of rock and roll came out of the church. And a lot of rock and roll was brought to the people by this little gadget. This is me over at Rye Beach back in September. The transistor radio. I had a woman a couple of weeks ago, prior to the Omicron breaking out, and she was saying, and she's smiling, the transistor radio. I used to keep it under my bed so I could listen to Little Richard under my pillow. The transistor radio, music and information suddenly became portable. No matter how isolated you were, you could hear the news of the world. Teenagers could listen to music anywhere they wanted, and that included being far away from adults' ears. Transistor radio helped spark a musical revolution, rock and roll, at a time when television was killing radio and all those old serials, everything else were being canceled, but music was taking its place. And teenagers wanted to dance to their own music, and I'm not sure I would wear those shoes with jeans like that. There's the poodle skirt, all that other stuff, and sock hops were big. Why rock and roll? Well, the pop music of the early 1950s was bland, and also the economy had heated up, and teenagers were able to get part-time jobs, and they had money to buy a 45 or 78. The American economy was white hot, and it swelled the disposable income of high schoolers and college kids. The independent-minded youth wanted their own sound, and they got it. Rock and roll, and you might have gone to something like that. Rock and roll, a new style of music which drew inspiration from American or African American blues music, embraced themes popular among teenagers such as young love and rebellion against authority. You got to remember, these were the days of James Dean and Marlon Brando, Rebel Without a Cause, all that stuff. The Perfect Storm, music aimed at teenagers in their pocketbooks, a new technology, the transistor radio. Rock and roll had arrived. Wop bop a loop bop a wop bomb boom. Tutti frutti. Well, what was that? What's that lyric? Well, Little Richard wrote that lyric either to describe a drum fill he wanted, or maybe that's how he talked back to his boss as a dishwasher at the Macon, Georgia Greyhound station. The song, Tutti Frutti, released on Specialty 561. The record entered the Billboard Rhythm and Blues chart at the end of December 1958, number 2 in February 1956. Pat Boone's version of the song did better on the charts. The New York Daily News, the slogan, tell it to Sweeney, until they ran out of Sweeney's, which is why they got in trouble, and still are in trouble today. They barely put out a newspaper. In fact, the New York Daily News's headquarters today is the Allentown Morning Call. That's where most of their offices are, Allentown, Pennsylvania. Anyway, the New York Daily News called the music an insider of juvenile delinquency and pointed a finger at the disc jockey who had worked at WABC and WINS in New York, Alan Freed, chief offender. Little Richard, they didn't want me to be in the white guy's way. I felt I was pushed into a rhythm and blues corner to keep out of the rockers' way because it's where the money is. When Tutti Frutti came out, they needed a rock star to block me out of the white homes because I was a hero to white kids. White kids would have Pat Boone upon the dresser and me in the drawer because they liked my version better. But the families didn't want me because of the image I was projecting. Tutti Frutti, Little Richard, and Pat Boone. Tutti Frutti earned Richard Penniman, or Little Richard, his first career Billboard chart entry in 1955, debuting at number 12 on the bestsellers in store chart that November, and reaching number 17 on the most played in jukeboxes tally in 1956. But Pat Boone's cover did better in 1956. And Pat Boone was a star, an absolute star. Take a look at him 66 years ago in Akron, Ohio. Today, Pat Boone, I watch Buzzer TV because I watch old game shows, and I see the Pat Boone commercial with the bathtub where you can open the door instead of stepping over the bathtub into the tub. You just open the door. The covers. At the end of 1955, Pat Boone notched his first #1 hit with a rendition of Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame. But Little Richard and Fats said they made more money from my versions, according to Pat Boone, crossing over to the mainstream. Here's an interview with Little Richard when he was asked about me and how he felt when he heard my version of the song, and he said, I was washing dishes at the Greyhound bus station in Macon when I heard Pat Boone doing my song, threw down my towel, and knew my time had come. That was Fats Domino's house in New Orleans. My friend Dean Shapiro said, we're driving around one day. I'm in New Orleans. He said, want to go see Fats? I said, sure. I said, don't you have to let him know? He said, nah, we'll just drop in. Unfortunately, Fats wasn't there, but that was Fats Domino's home in the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. And you can't see it from this picture, but on the roof, there were dominoes. Fats Domino. Fats and Pat Boone. In New Orleans, after we're both doing great, according to Pat Boone, I was working at the Fairmont Hotel, and he asked me to come over to Al Hirt, the trumpet player, Al Hirt's place, where he was playing. In the middle of the set, he held up one of his diamond rings, said to the audience, see this ring? This man, Pat Boone, bought me this ring. And we sang, Ain't That a Shame, together. Oh, Maybelline, why can't you be true? Well, Maybelline, one of Chuck Berry's big songs. Kind of a weird title when you come to think of how it came about. So there's a St. Louis singer by the name of Chuck Berry, goes up to Chicago. He was a hairdresser, goes up to Chicago to cut a song for the Chess Brothers, Leonard and Phil Chess and Chess Records in Chicago. It's called Ida May, which might have been based on a song called Ida Red. Chess likes the songs, the Chess Brothers like the song, but they think it's a little too similar to Ida Red. But they have a simple solution, get a new name. It's not as simple as you think. And that was a problem, so nobody could think of a name, the pianist Johnny Johnson says. We looked on the windowsill, there's a mascara box up there with Maybelline written on it. And Leonard Chess said, why don't we name the damn thing Maybelline? And there is a young Chuck Berry. Maybelline quickly rose to #1 on the R&B charts. In August, it hit #5 on the pop chart at 1010 Wins New York. WINS. The disc jockey, Alan Freed, played the song for 2 straight hours. Meanwhile, near Memphis, a relatively unknown singer by the name of Elvis Presley, who was bouncing around the South, began to include the song in his own performances. And there's this guy, Asa Carter. Asa Carter, who would reinvent himself in the second part of his life, which is more interesting maybe than this part. Asa Carter. This is Billboard magazine, and Asa Carter is down in Alabama. And Billboard magazine, the title of the article, "Segregationists would ban all rock roll hits." And the story, high school and college students, tavern and restaurant owners, radio stations, and most of all, jukebox operators are up in arms over a declaration by a white citizens council led Thursday that rock and roll has got to go. Asa Carter, executive secretary of the North Alabama Council, said at a rally that rock and roll was inspired by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and other pro-integration forces. He indicated that the council would punish the names of music operators and locations who failed to ban the records. April 18th, Time Magazine, White Council versus Rock and Roll. April 18th, 1956, the White Citizens Council of Alabama, Asa Carter again, formed to fight desegregation, are equally opposed to jazz, which they consider part of the NAACP's plot to mongrelize America. Ace Carter, self-appointed leader of the North Alabama Citizens Council, said last week that bebop, rock and roll, and all Negro music are designed to force Negro culture on the South. And there is Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. And this is a whole set of other problems up north because rock and roll is now drawing people who like to fight. Asbury Park, New Jersey, 1956. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers were stars. In Asbury Park, Joseph William and Albert Rediker, jewelers who had been leasing the convention center in Asbury Park for 10 years from the city, were looking to book a rock and roll act that summer. And the Redikers booked Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers for a show on June 30th, 1956. Now, these guys are teenagers. What are they doing out after 11 o'clock, you might ask? Anyway, when Lyman and the Teenagers took the stage just before the clock struck 11, the kids pressed forward onto the floor to get a closer look. The Teenagers had barely started their second song when a fight broke out. Asbury Park police were called to the scene, restored order. The fighting broke out again by midnight. Joseph Rediker had called off the show, and 3,000 disappointed teenagers go onto the boardwalk. More fights break out. According to newspaper accounts at the time, the Asbury Park police called for backup and got police officers from as far away as Red Bank, home at Count Basie, and Long Branch. 25 people were injured. Some suffered only cuts and bruises. Dozens of teenagers taken into custody, although only 8 charges were filed against, filed against 8 of them. No more rock and roll shows. The Convention Hall, Boardwalk, Asbury Park, New Jersey's largest dance floor, 3,000 comfortable seats. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, among others. Freddie Price and his entire orchestra, and it was $1.80 to get in, which actually, when you think about it now, $20. New Jersey bans Bill Haley. Time Magazine, July 23rd, 1956. After a riot in Asbury Park, New Jersey's Convention Hall that sent 25 vibrating teenagers to the hospital, the mayor, Roland J. Hines, slapped a rock and roll ban on all city dance halls. Taking a hint, Jersey City canceled Jasmine Paul Whiteman's Rock and Roll Under the Stars show at the 24,000-seat Roosevelt Stadium. Bill Haley and his Comets can't come to New Jersey or Jersey City. Bill Haley and his Comets, among the groups that were shut out by the Jersey City ban, and put up a defense of sorts on the choruses of a ditty called Teenager's Mother. Sample lyrics defend the band's actions. Teenager's Mother, are you so right? Did you forget so soon? Just how much you like to do the Charleston? Which, of course, was the big thing for the Flappers 30 years earlier. And the Flappers were not well received either. back in the 1920s. And so, things, everything goes in a circle. Bo Diddley. Elvis Presley's peg pants, gyrating hips, and Bo Diddley's use of his guitar as a phallic symbol, according to some people, columnists and newspapers, were just not very professional on stage. Meanwhile, here's Elvis, and here's Sam Phillips. Now, Sam Phillips sent Howling Wolf and B.B. King up to Chicago, and he starts looking for a white guy who could sing like a black guy. In 1954, he'd find that man in Elvis Presley, and together they would create the music that would come to be known briefly as rockabilly. Sam Phillips tells Rolling Stone, he, Elvis, remember Elvis is a truck driver for a lecture company, not a utility, for a local store. He's working for Crown Electric. I'd seen that truck go back and forth outside, and I thought they're sure doing a hell of a lot of business around here, said Sam Phillips. I never saw it stop anywhere. So Elvis had case the joint for a long time before he stopped the truck and got out. And there's no telling how many days and nights behind that wheel he was figuring out some way to come in and make a record without saying, Mr. Phillips, did you audition me? So his mother's birthday gave him the opportunity to come in and make a little personal record. And there's Sam, and there is Elvis. There wasn't anything that striking about Elvis except his sideburns, which are down here. But you kind of thought, well, it's pretty cool, man. Ain't nobody else got them that damn long. We talked in the studio, and I played the record back for him in the control room on the little crystal turntable, and walked up front and told Marion, the secretary, to write down Elvis's name and number and how we could get a hold of him. Phillips didn't want Elvis to be a ballad singer, and he put together a band for him with Scotty Moore on guitar and Bill Black on bass, and they started to record Elvis. Eventually, DJ Fontana would be on the drums. Once he had the fundamentals of what I wanted, he was the first one I'd seen with that potential. He had a different type of voice, and this boy had listened to a lot of different music, from Grand Ole Opry to Bing Crosby to Dinah Shore to Crudup to Bill Monroe to Hank Snow. And there is Elvis's first real good record. That's All Right. Arthur Crudup was the guy who wrote that song. He wrote a whole bunch of songs. And the Grand Ole Opry. I was there in 2002. Grand Ole Opry. Enjoyed the show. It's a great show. Saw little Jimmy Dickens and Porter Wagner back then. Anyway, it's 1954, and Elvis tries out for the Grand Ole Opry, but Grand Ole Opry people aren't impressed with his October 2nd performance, and, maybe he should go back to driving a truck. Elvis, Scotty, and Bill quit their day jobs in October. They go on a show called the Louisiana Hayride. It's a live Saturday night country music radio show originating in Shreveport, Louisiana, over the radio station KWKH. The show is on the Grand Ole Opry, or actually the show is the Grand Ole Opry's chief competitor, and it's carried by 190 stations in 13 states, which is actually quite a large number of stations back in those days. And there is Elvis, Louisiana Hayride. He does so well that they signed him to a one-year contract. Every Saturday night, 52 straight Saturdays, that's his big break. He has records, has a regional gig, but it's a regional gig. The radio show is only in the South. He's selling records in the South. He's a regional performer. 1955, things start to change a little bit, because on November 21st, 1955, Sam Phillips sells Elvis's contract to RCA Records. Sam, I had looked at everything for how I could take a little extra money and get myself out of a real bind. I mean, I was broke, but man, it was hand to mouth. I made an offer to Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, who, by the way, was an illegal immigrant. And Elvis never performed outside of the United States except for a couple of gigs, one in Vancouver, one in Toronto, which meant he just went up and down and didn't need Tom Parker. But he never performed outside of the United States other than those gigs in 57, because Tom Parker was worried he was going to be caught as an illegal and deported back to Europe. Anyway, but the whole thing was, I made an offer. I didn't think they'd even consider $35,000. Plus, I owed Elvis $4,000 or $5,000. Rock and roll artists hadn't proven themselves yet. Elvis worked hard, sold some records, but was a middle-level performer on the circuit. Elvis recorded about 24 songs at Sun Studio in Memphis between 53 and 55. Blues, rhythm and blues, gospel, country, western, hillbilly, rockabilly, and bluegrass. All of those songs are now in the U.S. Congress National Recording Registry, and that was as of 2002. 1956, he's 21 years old, and he becomes a star. Here's the chronology. January 10th, Elvis records Heartbreak Hotel. January 18th, Elvis makes his first national TV appearance on CBS TV show, CBS's TV stage show, singing I've Got a Woman, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and Flip, Flop, and Fly. February 11th, RCA releases Heartbreak Hotel. April 3rd, Elvis appears in the Texaco Star Theater with Milton Berle. April 6th, Elvis fulfills his dreams. He's going to be a movie star. That's what he wanted to be because Paramount Studios signed Elvis to a 7-year deal. On June 5th, the problem starts. He returns to Milton Berle's show, sings Hound Dog, jerks his hips and legs, and that is obscene. To Ed Sullivan, it's obscene. To newspaper columnists, it's obscene. And if you look at it now, it's totally tame. But it was thoroughly obscene in 1956. Take a look at that. He's obscene. Elvis the Pelvis. Bob Hull has a column in the Los Angeles Herald Examiner TV Talk, June 5th. Elvis the Pelvis, the teenage singing idol who made his break into the big time a short while ago on the Milton Berle Show, helps Uncle Milty close out his season tonight. No one knows how the nickname started, but to some, it was meant to diminish his talents. Steve Allen, Elvis and the Basset Hound. Steve Allen was competing against Ed Sullivan on Sunday nights. The show booked Elvis. It would bring Allen some badly needed eyeballs in front of the TV. The columnist Charles Mercer was among those who urged Steve Allen to cancel Presley's appearance on the show. NBC even weighed in on Elvis's shenanigans. We think this lad has a great future, but we won't stand for any bad taste under any circumstances. The taming of Elvis, the muting of Elvis. Steve Allen. Well, you know, a couple of weeks ago on the Milton Berle Show, our next guest, Elvis Presley, received a great deal of attention, which some people seem to interpret one way and some viewers interpret it another. Naturally, it's our intention to do nothing but a good show. We want to do a show the whole family can watch and enjoy, and we always do. And tonight we're presenting Elvis Presley in his, what you might call, first comeback. And there is Steve Allen, and there is Elvis. Elvis dressed up in tails. The top hat, the Basset Dog. Most newspaper columnists, and for whatever reason back in the 1950s, newspaper columnists, Walter Winchell, Heather Hopper, held sway, Dorothy Kilgallen. I'm not sure why, but they had an enormous amount of impact on the culture. Walter Winchell in 1955 tried to kill the polio vaccine. True story. Said the government had little white coffins for all those little kids who were going to die from the polio vaccine. That was Walter Winchell. Rock and roll seemed to be a threat to the establishment. Elvis was humiliated. The next day, he's down in Memphis. He's performing before his hometown crowd, and he says, you know, those people in New York, they aren't going to change me none. I'm going to show you what the real Elvis is tonight. And Ed Sullivan, who swore he was never, ever, ever going to have Elvis on his show, has Elvis on the show because Elvis liked money. Hey, those morals I have, what morals? I don't have any morals. I like money. Ed Sullivan said Elvis would never appear on the show due to the perceived obscenity by the establishment. He changed his tune after he saw the Steve Allen show got bigger numbers, ratings, than he did on July 1st. Elvis's manager, the Colonel, Tom Parker, would negotiate the highest fee ever paid to an act by Sullivan to that point, $16,000 per show. They took it. In August, a judge in Jacksonville, Florida, threatened Presley with jail time if he didn't restrain himself during his live concerts. August 10th and 11th, Elvis was reduced to moving only his pinky finger. And there is Elvis on the Sullivan Show. September 9th, Elvis makes his first appearance on The Sullivan Show. Sullivan wasn't there. He was injured in a car crash and did not host the show. The English actor Charles Laughton was the master of ceremonies that night. Elvis attracted 60 million viewers. Elvis was in LA, and by the magic of microwave connections, he was on the show in New York, and the country saw it. Elvis appeared for a second time on The Sullivan Show, October 28th. Ed was back, and the viewers saw head to toe Elvis doing all his gyrations, performing Love Me Tender, Don't Be Cruel, and Hound Dog. Problem started again because of the gyrations. On January 6, 1957, Elvis makes his final ever Sullivan appearance. He was shot from the waist up. Polio shot. Elvis took one in the arm for polio. By Elvis getting the vaccine in front of millions before an Ed Sullivan show, the vaccine rates among American youth skyrocketed to 80% just after 6 months. At the time Elvis got his shot, it was less than 1%. Sam Phillips had other discoveries, as you can see him with Johnny Cash. There's Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Roy Orbison. Elvis, Cash, Lewis, and Perkins would be part of ushering in a new sound of music. There was one recording session featuring those four called the $1 Million Quartet, and they sung mostly gospel songs. Carl Perkins inspired the Beatles, worked with Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr. Carl Perkins was going to be a bigger star in Sam Phillips' mind than Elvis. Johnny Cash recorded with McCartney. Orbison was part of George Harrison's Traveling Wilburys. Perkins' career would almost be destroyed by a car crash. Hey, the girl can't help it. Girl can't help it. There's this film called The Girl Can't Help It that came out in 1956. And really, there's no story here other than watching Jane Mansfield's boobs, because that's the whole story, I think. And there's loads of music from the rock and rollers and even non-rock and rollers like Ray Anthony in this movie. And like I said, there's really no story except for Jane Mansfield's boobs. There seems to be some kind of story about some gangster who wants his girlfriend to become a rock star. The real stars in the movie are the rock and roll performers, not Tom Ewell, not Jane Mansfield's boobs, because they're shown the entire movie. Little Richard performs the title track, Fats Domino, Eddie Cochran. Gene Vincent had a big hit with Beat Bop Balula, or featured. The film gets the attention of a 15-year-old or 16-year-old in England named John Lennon, along with a 14-year-old by the name of Paul McCartney in Liverpool, who would have another rock group in another era. 19 songs were sung in the movie. Gogi Grant was not a rock and roller. Heartbreak Hotel, Elvis, Don't Be Cruel, Elvis, top two songs of 1956. Nelson Riddle, The Platters, rhythm and blues group. Gogi Grant, Les Baxter, Doris Day, Que Sera Sera. Her son Terry Melcher would be a rock and roll producer and was the target of Charles Manson in 1969. Hound Dog, Elvis, Memories Are Made of These, Dean Martin. Elvis idolized Dean Martin. And the Rock and Roll Waltz, which is not a rock and roll song by K-Star. Long live rock and roll. That's me in Cleveland 5 years ago. There's money to be made. Rock and roll, a teenager must. Billboard magazine, November 10th, 1956. Rock and roll is no longer a novelty. Its honeymoon period with teenagers is over, and the reappraisal of its present appeal and future potential is taking place on the station management level. 79 of 179 managers participating in Billboard's survey admitted that they've had to continually increase programming of rock and roll to the public opinion. The typical management attitude today is that a judicious amount of rock and roll time for peak teenage hours is obligatory. While there may have been many complaints and alienations within other listening segments of the population because of the excessive exposure of rock and roll, most analysts agree that the current music is here to stay. Well, yes and no, because 1956 and 57, at least for the early days of rock and roll, are the peak. The big beat in Jim Crow, and that's Alan Freed, and he's kind of looking downcast, because he should be, because the big beat was supposed to be the big show. Never happened. On May 4th, The Big Beat with Alan Freed becomes the first nationally televised rock and roll dance show. Now, ABC wasn't a very big network. They had something like 18, 19 affiliates. In fact, it would be the Mickey Mouse Club that would make the ABC TV network that started in 1955. The show was a summer replacement, but it would go into the 1957-58 TV season if it attracted an audience, which it did, except the show was doomed. The TV show featured a live performance by Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Frankie Lyman is again in the middle of all of this, like Asbury Park. Lyman was shown dancing with a white girl. The dance scene enraged ABC's Southern affiliates. The network canceled the program. But there was another program around. In fact, in every city, there was kind of a music show. Jack Spector, who was on WMCA radio in the 1960s, had one in Providence. Lloyd Thaxton had one in Cleveland. And Bob Horn had one in Philadelphia. It was called Bandstand. It started in 1952. But it was a radio show. But on October 7th, 1952, WFLI, Channel 6 in Philadelphia, debuted an afternoon series called Bandstand. Bandstand featured teens dancing to the records of crooners like Frankie Lane, Tony Bennett, who recently retired, Perry Como, and the local boy, Eddie Fisher. Bob Horn took the radio version of Bandstand to television. Lee Stewart was his co-host. But by 1956, there were problems. Bob Horn would be replaced by Dick Clark on July 9th. Horn's trouble stemmed from his alcoholism and alleged predatory sexual behavior. Meanwhile, here's this young, squeaky guy by the name of Dick Clark. Look at him. He's just young and he's squeaky clean. And he looks squeaky clean in the part. He would take the show from a local Philadelphia program to a national audience on ABC, and the name would be changed to American Bandstand. And there's Dick Clark presiding over Bandstand in the Philadelphia studio. Clark pitched the show to ABC. He said it was cheap and would have appeal to a youth demographic. And ABC at that point was the third-ranking network. Dumont had just gone out of business, and it didn't really pick up too many viewers because CBS and NBC had them all. On August 5th, 1957, ABC aired the first national broadcast of American Bandstand, still filmed live in Philadelphia from 3:30 to 4 o'clock Eastern Time. It became an immediate, became an immediate rating smash. And 2 days later, Paul Anka, think of this, Paul Anka, 65 years ago, he was the first performer and he made his national debut on television singing his new song, Diana, the first performer live on the show. By 1958, daily viewership reached 8,400,000. American Bandstand was ABC's top-rated program. And also, in 1957, there was this Queens duo from Forest Hills named Tom and Jerry, better known as Simon and Garfunkel later on. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel as Tom and Jerry, with Paul being Tom and Garfunkel being Jerry Landis, debuted on Bandstand, November 22nd, 57. Jerry Lee Lewis, March 18th, 1958. Demon and the Belmonts from the Bronx. Little Italy by Arthur Avenue, August 7th, 1958. Elvis Buys Graceland, 1957. Rock and roll was blazing hot in 57. Elvis dominated the pop charts, 25 weeks at number 1, 4 different songs. July, American Bandstand goes on the air. Dick Clark. Jerry Lee Lewis emerges. Bill Haley and his Comets complete a successful world tour, including the UK, Europe, and Australia. Little Richard continues ripping up the charts with 4 hit singles concurrently on both the pop and R&B charts, including Lucille. April 1957, the Del Vikings, number 4 on the US pop chart, number 2 with their debut single, Come and Go With Me, and it's not to the penitentiary, although somebody else thought those were the words. Rock and roll blazing in 57. Send For Me, song written by Ollie Jones, performed by Nat King Cole, featuring the McCoy Boys. Reached number 1 on the US R&B chart and number 6 on the pop chart. Now, there's an interesting song that Nat King Cole once had in his live act called Mr. Cole Won't Rock and Roll. Wrong. Send for Me is a rock and roll song. And he did a couple others which were very rock and roll. Little Richard's records sold, but in 1957, Little Richard songs were not covered by Pat Boone anymore. I was the originator, but the parents didn't let the kids buy my records. They told them to buy Pat Boone records. And here is Lennon with the Quarry Men, and they're out there for the first time. John Lennon in Liverpool, July 6, 1957. Lennon is 16 years old, and his group, the Quarry Men, performing. It's July 6th, the annual Wootton Parish Church Garden Fete, where John Lennon and his Quarry Men skiffle group played. 15-year-old Paul McCartney watched and was impressed with Lennon's ability to ad-lib in place of forgotten lyrics in songs like Come and Go With Me, Down to the Penitentiary. Eddie Cochran, 20 Flight Rock. Well, Ivan Vaughn introduces Lennon to McCartney. Vaughn knew both. Paul was there with a guitar for whatever reason, and began playing Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock. Then Gene Vincent's Beep Bop-A-Lula, then the medley of Little Richard's numbers. He had his set all ready to go. McCartney would join the Quarry Men 2 years later. The Everly Brothers in Nashville. Phil and Don Everly were important to Nashville. They were the first consistently successful rock and roll act to come from there. Their management, their songs came from Nashville, and they recorded there with local session musicians. In 1957, the Everlys had a string of hits, including Bye Bye Love, Wake Up a Little Susie, which became Simon and Garfunkel, part of their set list. All I Have to Do Is Dream, Bird Dog, and others. And they became Grand Ole Opry members on June 1st, 1957, after Elvis didn't. It was the end for the originators by 1958. That 4-year period where rock and roll accelerates is over suddenly. Rock and roll comes to a halt in 1958. The adults won. Rock and roll pioneers are elsewhere due to various reasons. Elvis joins the army, gets his hair cut. He was inducted into the military in 1958, 2 weeks after wrapping his movie King Creole, which he sang part of the soundtrack. He trained at Fort Hood, Texas. He took some breaks to record music, meaning when he got out, he could sell it. But according to John Lennon, Elvis died creatively when he joined the army. Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, Little Richard, and Fats Domino would fill the void. Little Richard would go to Bible school. He didn't know what he was. Was he a religious guy or was he the crazy rock and roller? He gives up music in 1957 and begins to attend the Alabama Bible School, Oakwood College, and he's ordained as a minister. He would have one more top hit in 1958, Good Golly, Miss Molly. It was covered by Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels later on. He never had a top 10 hit again after 1958. Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin, which was a problem. At the age of 13, Myra Brown married Jerry Lee Lewis in Hernando, Mississippi on December 12, 1957. When Lewis arrived in London for a 37-date tour, May 1958, Brown revealed to a reporter at the airport she was his wife. Lewis asserted that Brown was 15 years old and his wife of 2 months. The British tabloids ripped into Lewis. They ripped into him. They ripped him to shreds, and his career took a nosedive right into the concrete. George Harrison would join the Quarry Men in 1958 on February 6th, which is today, and it's 64 years ago. George Harrison joined the Liverpool skiffle group, the Quarry Men. He's added to the John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Len Gary, Eric Griffins, and John Lowe lineup. Harrison was recommended to Lennon by McCartney, though Lennon said no. He's 14 years old, which he was, way too young. In fact, he would be 15 in February. Harrison got in by playing the hit Raunchy. Big hit. The group would record 2 songs in 1958. Buddy Holly's That Would Be the Day and a Harrison-McCartney composition, In Spite of All the Danger, which was written by Paul, with George just playing the lead guitar because they didn't know how music credits went those days. Band in Boston. Rock and roll's banned in Boston. There was a lot of band in Boston. May 3rd, 1958, show at the Boston Arena was a major problem for Alan Freed. He's charged with inciting a riot. In 1958, he emceed and managed the 17-act Big Beat show. Featured Jerry Lee Lewis, Frankie Lyman, Chuck Berry, and Danny and the Juniors. Kids packed into the aisles, singing along and dancing, but things started to get a little out of hand. A few bottles were broken, a scuffle broke out, the show was stopped. 15 people were beaten and robbed in the streets after the show, but none of the perpetrators ever caught. Only one arrest made, that of Alan Freed. Now, Alan Freed had had a target on his back for a long time because he was the main inciter of juvenile delinquency. Although, if you look at the 50s, there were a lot of things that went on in the 50s that were covered up. The 50s weren't as innocent as people say it was. And he was charged with inciting a riot. The case never went to trial. On May 5th, the mayor, John B. Hines, banned rock and roll shows in the city of Boston. Those so-called rock and roll music programs are a disgrace and must be stopped. As far as I'm concerned, Boston has seen the last of them. Other East Coast cities banned rock and roll shows. And here comes the next blow, payola and rock and roll. Payola had been around for years, the paying of cash and gifts in exchange for airplay. Hey, Jolson, radio, 1920s, Jolson, right? He was part of it. The adults in the establishment felt very threatened by rock and roll and the changing lifestyle. It was time to kill off rock and roll and going after disc jockeys for briberies, like Alan Freed and Dick Clark. Remember, Dick Clark is squeaky clean. Alan Freed wasn't. Alan Freed and Dick Clark both played important parts in the rise of rock and roll. Clark refused to play white cover versions of black songs, such as Pat Boone's Tutti Frutti. Freed ended up taking the fall for disc jockeys everywhere. His career was ruined. He lost his job at WABC in New York. Freed was defiant, and Dick Clark, again, looked squeaky clean. Take a look at him. The hair is all good. Hey, he looks innocent, doesn't he? He actually wasn't. Dick Clark divested himself of all incriminating connections, as he had part ownership in 7 independent labels, 6 publishers, 3 record distributors, and 2 talent agencies. ABC told him, get rid of all that. You're not part of it. Just bury it. The committee chairman in the House, Orrin Harris, called him a fine young man. You might know some of these people if you ever went up to the Catskills and went to Pines or Cutchers. Larry Strickler was the MC at the shows up in the Borscht Belt. His wife, Shelley Strickler, was on WOR radio for a long time. Me in the background, this is New York Press Club. And the guy in the blue sweater, Mitch Levy, is still on WINS. He was a 16-year-old disc jockey back in 1958. Just sent him birthday greetings. I said, you sound great for a guy who's 80 years old now. But he took Alan Freed's place in the sock hop, which he tells me is a ridiculous story because he's 16, he's living in Brooklyn, he has no car, and he's got to get out to Long Island to take the place of his of Alan Freed, and somehow he got a ride and he hosted the sock hop at the age of 16. By the way, this guy over here, Larry Strickler, was a child actor. He is to my right, your left in the picture. He was a child actor on the Milton Berle Show. The day the music died, and that's Diamond Dave Somerville, who knew Buddy Holly. And February 3rd, 1959 is the day that music died. In the early morning hours, February 3rd, 1959, 3 performers, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and JP, the Big Bopper Richardson, joined their pilot, Roger Peterson, for what was supposed to be a flight to their next stop. The passengers and the pilots never made it to the destination. Instead, they were in that deadly plane crash in Iowa that took the lives on board. That's the wreckage. Dave had traveled with Buddy Holly on tours, and he said that from what he knew, Buddy just wanted to take a warm bath and get off the bus. He was heading in a different direction musically, but he needed the money because those tours paid rather well in 1950, so he could get a plane, charter a plane. The pilot was not qualified for the plane and also went up in bad weather. Paul Anka and Fabian were brought in to finish the tour. While it is known, February 3rd, the day the music died, one of the earlier tour stops was in Duluth, Minnesota. And Buddy Holly made an impression on a teenager by the name of Robert Zimmerman, who went to the show that day. And would later be known as Bob Dylan. Ray Charles, What I Say, was created when the singer somehow ran out of material near the end of a gig in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. He began playing a rocking riff and improvising lyrics over it, telling his backup singers, the Raelettes, as in the Raelettes, I'm going to fool around and y'all just follow me. And Ray delivered an instant classic in the call and response style. Song becomes a problem. It's too long and had the lyrics shake that thing and orgasmic sounds. What I Say was banned by many black and white radio stations. Mr. Freed goes to Washington. November 1959 closed in open sessions before the U.S. House Oversight Committee. 335 disc jockeys from around the country admitted to having received $63,000 in consulting fees. That figure only the tip of the payola iceberg. Before the hearings, Phil Lynn, who was in Chicago forever as a disc jockey, he was at WAIT and continued after this, confessed he had once taken $22,000 to play one record. The trial heated up. The two most influential jocks in the country took the stand, Dick Clark and Alan Freed. Freed took the fall. In 1960, Congress amended the Federal Communications Act to outlaw under-the-table payments and require broadcasters to disclose if an airplay for a song had been purchased. Payola became a misdemeanor with a penalty of up to $10,000 in fines and some prison time. Chuck Berry, his downfall, 1960. Rock and roll had become sanitized by 1960. Raw sounds were gone. Ricky Nelson, Tommy Stans, Bobby V, Bobby Rydell, Frankie Avalon, Fabian, and Del Shannon were the teen idols. Elvis, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis were history. Meanwhile, Chuck Berry was hanging on, but wouldn't hang on much longer. December 23rd, 1959, he's arrested in St. Louis on charges relating to the transportation of a 14-year-old girl across state lines for allegedly immoral purposes. He was convicted on March 11th, 1960, 5 years in jail, $5,000 fine, but his conviction was vacated in the new trial ordered by a federal appeals court because of disparaging racial remarks made by a judge in his original trial, which was kind of odd because I thought there was no such thing as double jeopardy. Berry would be convicted again on a retrial March of 1961 and would be in prison for 2 years. Bland, Bland, Bland. Number one song, 1960, Percy Faith. Number two, Jim Reeves. Well, the Everlys there, Kathy's Clown. A terrible song called Running Bear, number 4. An even worse song, Mark Dinning, number 5. Brenda Lee, I'm Sorry. Elvis is Back, Now or Never. Good song, Handyman. Jimmy Jones, done by James Taylor eventually. Stuck on You, and the song that would introduce a new dance, Chubby Checker and the Twist. The legacy from the early days of rock and roll, 54 through 58 mostly. There's Elvis, Steve Allen on The Steve Allen Show. Alan Freed died a broken man on January 20th, 1965 in 1986. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 1991, given a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2002. He received the Grammy Trustees Award. While Dick Clark thrived on TV with American Bandstand, as well as being a shrewd businessman, game show host, $20,000 Pyramid or the Pyramids, and the New Year's Eve TV host. Sam Phillips never regretted selling off Elvis's contract to RCA in 1955. He made a lot of money investing in a small hotel chain called Holiday Inn. Steve Allen wrote many songs, claimed there was no pressure on him to tame Elvis. Elvis was the king of rock and roll, but never regained that throne after he went into the Army in 1958. Became a novelty act. Little Richard never had a big hit again after 1958. Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis continued down the road, performing, but never achieved the heights again. Ray Charles continued performing and had big hits, even though he was busted for heroin. He became sort of a TV kind of guy on TV shows in the 1980s, including Golden Girls. Johnny Cash had some major hits, including A Boy Named Sue. Carl Perkins never regained his stature after a car accident. Phillips thought he'd be bigger than Elvis. Bill Haley and his Comets found some success in Europe, but he was largely forgotten. He had a modest revival when the TV show Happy Days used Rock Around the Clock for its opening. And that is Leslie Gore with Quincy Jones. And I know Leslie's mother. She's 99 years old. Ronnie Gore, she lives up in Darien, Connecticut. We're kind of friendly. The Chess Brothers were introduced into the Blues Hall of Fame. And interest in rock and roll was subsiding in America. But in major British urban centers like Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, and London, they got hooked on rock and roll and rock and rollers from American blues players. And that begat the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, and other groups, Herman's Hermits. Women singers took on prominence in rock and roll in the 1960s. Leslie Gore, 1963. She did an anthem, You Don't Own Me, which women today still relate to. You Don't Own Me. It remains a feminist hit. In the early days of rock and roll, before Leslie Gore's You Don't Own Me, women sang songs about boys, including Leslie Gore, It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Want To, or It's Judy's Turn to Cry. Songs by women were about boys getting dumped, getting approval, bragging about boys who liked them. Leslie Gore's song would change all that. You Don't Own Me. The Beatles, Ed Sullivan, 73 million people saw the show. February 9th, 1964. The Rolling Stones and other rock acts were showcased on that show. Oh, rock and roll shows, they went back to Boston and other cities. Everly Brothers, one of the most successful acts ever in popular music, particularly 57 to 62. Only Elvis and Pat Boone outsold them, and major influences on the Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel. And remember Asa Carter? Remember the segregationist Asa Carter? Well, he became Forrest Carter. He reinvented himself as a novelist. In the 1970s, he published 4 books, Gone to Texas, later made into the Clint Eastwood Western, The Outlaw Josie Wales, The Vengeance Trial of Josie Wales, The Education of Little Tree, and Watch for Me on the Mountain. Barbara Walters was fooled on the Today Show by Carter. Nobody did the research on Carter. The nonfiction Education of Little Tree would go on to sell more than 1 million copies. Carter died in 1979. The book was re-released in the 1990s. The book fooled Oprah Winfrey, among others. Nobody bothered to look into who Forrest Carter was. He was a segregationist who said that rock and roll was trying to force the Negro culture on whites. Meanwhile, the rebellious teenagers grew up, but there were new trends like the twist and chubby checker. The era was brief, but there was a whole lot of shaking going on. Thank you for inviting me, Lisa. Any questions, any comments? The floor is all yours.
Wow. You just brought me back to my youth. I mean, everything you said, I remember. I was even on American Bandstand one time, you know? Oh my goodness. Thank you so very much. I mean, it was intriguing. It really was. Wow. I can't
Did you have the poodle skirts and the transistor radio and all that?
Yeah. And yeah. I'm a Bronxite. Did you live in the Bronx? Were you from the Bronx?
I was born in Manhattan, moved to Queens, moved up to Rockland County, and I'm down here in Westchester now. So yeah, the Bronx. That's Bronx. The Bronx is where the rich people lived.
Lived up.
When you were on the Lower East Side, the Bronx. It was the Bronx, and the rich people lived up there.
Lived lived up there.
Yeah, lived up there.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Evan.
You're going to be back again?
I don't know. Ask Lisa.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Does anyone have any questions here?
This is the boomer age.
Baby boomers.
Yeah.
Boomers, we're boomers.
Oh, we have some questions.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
What about ever considering doing a movie on this whole scenario of the 50s and what impact it plays on the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond? Wow.
Well, I think American Graffiti in Greece kind of caught part of it, right? There have been movies about it.
They did a scenario, but what more of like a documentary?
Oh, there were plenty of documentaries. A&E when Peter Jennings was alive, did the fabulous 50s. In fact, if you go up to YouTube, there are all kind of 50s. PBS did the local station in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and there's one out of Minnesota. And if you go up to YouTube, you could find it. And the one in Eastern Pennsylvania was really interesting in terms of what went on in terms of where the kids dance with the poodle skirts and the pants and the peg pants and all that other stuff, and in England the mods and the teddies. So there's a lot of material on that, and the show Happy Days was based on that. And Gary Marshall, where did he come from? Who created Happy Days? Came from Marshalloo Parkway. Somebody's raising their hand there.
Yeah, I would like to.
Can't hear her, so somebody's going to have to relay it to me.
Okay, it's just a comment.
Yeah.
So now I know, I was born in 1951. So now I know why in the 60s, my mother wouldn't let me go to any rock concerts. Because of all the riots.
Yeah.
And
You
that's
didn't
why
know that. You didn't know that.
No, I didn't. I had no idea there were all those riots. And I wanted to go to the Murray the K concerts. There were Murray the K concerts. You joined a fan club, and he had really good stars, and it was in Brooklyn. And my friend's mother wanted to take me. And my friend went, a couple of other friends went, but I wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
And that's my story.
And I need to interrupt, is anyone taking the van home?
If you were born earlier, you would have been able to go, because that's before everything all hell.
Yeah, but you were-
I
I just wanted to say thank you very much. That was quite a presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, that's it. I'm glad you enjoyed. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me. My name is Evan.
Thank you. Glad you could make it.
And
Okay,
and we'll
Bye.
talk again. Have a good day,
Okay.
everybody, and be safe. We'll see you soon. Bye bye. My name is
Bye.
Evan Winger. Goodbye.
So,
Sorry.
so-